Our presentation energy panel is coming up now. Jeff Mikulina is going to lead it and introduce the people on his panel. You probably all know Jeff or know of Jeff. Before Robert Harris, he spent 10 years as the director of the Oahu Group, or the Sierra Club Hawaii chapter. I almost demoted him, sorry, Jeff. But in those 10 years, he did pretty good for a Haole guy. Came into Hawaii and got lots of bills passed through the legislature, has a great reputation for being able to work the system. The bottle bill, for example, would not have become law in Hawaii without Jeff and the Sierra Club's efforts. Solar roofs, the whole panoply of environmental issues that have been passed here in Hawaii. At some point you'll look back and you can draw a line to Jeff's work in the past decade. He's now the executive director of the Blue Planet Foundation and my boss, so I can't say enough nice things about him, but Jeff, please come on up and introduce your panel.
Well, it's great to sorry, I'm kind of fighting a cold, but it's great to see a room full of familiar faces, but also friendly faces, because I've spent a lot of time in this room with familiar faces, but not so friendly faces. I just have to say before I call the panel up that it just struck me when Gary was saying that. First time to Hawaii, and it was the winter of 1994. I was a sophomore in college, and I went to an environmental legislative network meeting, which is, I think, that's similar to this in some form. And I met two people. I met Dave Rainey, right back there, and Gary Gill. And it struck me, here's Gary Gill. All I knew about Hawaii was Magnum PI, so here's this Tom Selleck lookalike guy. And then here's Dave Rainey, and I knew he did coral reef stuff, but the whole meeting he was intently taking notes. And I was really impressed with this. You know, everyone's really focused on environmental policy. And then when the hour-long meeting was over, I realized he was just animating, drawing. And I think that's what you're back to now, right? Yeah, that's great. All right, so mahalo, Robert, for putting this together. I really think I see a future for Sierra Club. It's coming together finally after 10 years of... But let's bring up the panel. Mark Duda and Keikoa. I saw it, Keikoa. Kaluhiva. So first, Mark Duda is with the Hawaii Solar Energy Association. He's actually Dr. Mark Duda. He has quite a pedigree behind him, but he's now working with the solar industry. He's one of the sharpest folks in Hawaii focused on policy. Coming up next is Keikoa Kaluhiva. He's a Kamehameha Schools graduate. Worked for a number of years with Senator Akaka, and now he is external relations for a company called First Wind. And First Wind is a large utility-scale wind farm developer. They operate the Kaheava wind farm in Maui, and they're building a wind farm at Kahuku on this island. So you'll note that we have two renewable energy guys up here, and this isn't going to be pitting solar versus wind. Yeah. The purpose of this is going to be pitting clean energy and good policy versus a future that's tied to fossil fuel and expensive and dirty. So that's what we hope to get out of this. You'll notice that there's no one from the state. Is anyone from DBED in the audience by any chance? Who's safe? Utility? Anyone from the utility? So no one from the state or the utility is joining us, and you might be thinking, well, this is probably because Jeff kind of waited too long and neglected to call them in time. You're partly true, but more importantly, we really want to hear from the folks that are in the trenches trying to get clean energy plugged into the grid and trying to create this clean energy future. Not that the state and the utilities not, but I really think we ought to hear from those that are getting their hands dirty, actually making it happen. So, just I want to provide a quick lay of the land, and then we'll turn over to some questions. But then while we're going, I hope we can get a lot of questions from you folks and grill them with the tough questions. So. First time using PowerPoint. All right, out of Macintosh. So Hawaii, obviously completely tied to oil. We have import about 45 million barrels of petroleum every year in different forms. This costs us a lot, 4, 5, 6 billion, depending on the mix. We have a 1 super tanker per week habit in Hawaii. It runs our power plants, it runs our cars, it runs our airplanes. The mix is about a third when you look at the barrel. I know this is a review for most of you, but we're just blessed with all of these resources that we can tap into. We've been talking about clean energy in this state forever. In fact, 1974, here's this great state plan. 1977, there was a Senate plan crafted in this building, right, this building, that looked at what would it take to make Hawaii energy independent by the year 2010. January 1st, 2010, looking at self-sufficiency except for jet fuel. And I apologize, this is the wrong cover of the report. It's an old slide. But nonetheless, here's the state looking at this in depth. How can we get there, and what happened? Well, oil prices plummeted. We kind of lost track of things and forgot it, and we hit snooze. We've been thinking about this for a lot longer than a generation. In fact, this is a letter to the editor in 1902, erstwhile Honolulu Advertiser. And it's great because this letter writer talks about, let's tap into the Nu'uanu Pali for power. And the last line, I know you can't read it, says, Honolulu will remain an inferior place until we can tap into our natural resources for power. So it's over a century of trying to get Hawaii off oil, and yet we've gone the other direction. So we're completely tied to that barrel. Unlike other challenges in Hawaii, energy is really, it's simple, you know? I mean, we can just draw a box around the state, and we know everything that comes in, or all our fossil fuel comes in by boat. All of our energy is primarily coming in by boat, except for the bit that is generated locally. So we can characterize our problem pretty easily, unlike some of the other ones. We're going to hear about food later and waste, and some of those are very intractable. Energy is difficult, but at least we can view it fairly simply. And when we look at that barrel, like I mentioned, you can break it up a little over, 35, 36%, depending, changes by year, goes to cars, trucks, ships. Another chunk that's a little bit less than a third goes to airplanes, and then the remaining goes to electricity. Electricity seems to be the focus right now because we have a monopoly utility provider that we can really create good policy to tap into clean energy. So if you look at the electricity use, just so we get a feel for where the electricity goes, you can see how that's broken out. What's interesting here is, anyone know what that last sliver is? Us. Well, it's all us, but homes, you're right. So that's an easy chunk to focus on, and Blue Planet Foundation has been doing a lot of effort there and trying to increase efficiency and reach people in the residential side. So let's take a quick lay of the land policy-wise. On our books today, we have a law that requires that 40% of energy in the state, in electricity sector, come from clean energy sources, or renewable as it's defined in statute, by 2030. And there's some interim goals to achieve that also. There's also a requirement that approximately 30% of our, we see a 30% energy reduction by the year 2030 from a baseline. But the thing is, penalties are pretty weak. If the utility fails to achieve this, they barely will experience much harm, and they can in fact come back and argue for changing the limits. So we do have a law, and it's one of the more aggressive ones in the nation to require. It's called Renewable Portfolio Standard. But the penalties are fairly weak, and again, that only applies for electricity. We also have various building code requirements for new homes and the like, but not very aggressive. Incentives, so I kind of broke this into policy and incentives. Incentives to encourage clean energy investment, we have a 35% income tax credit that's capped at $5,000 for residential, for photovoltaic and small wind, and then $500,000 for commercial, so those large, on top of Walmart and the like. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Not yet, though. And then net metering. And net metering is a policy that encourages solar and small wind by letting folks spin their meter backwards, essentially, and kind of get credit for that extra energy they put back on the grid. They don't get paid for it. That's a different policy. But they can dump it back onto the grid and get those credits for over a year. So for smaller systems, that most homeowners that have photovoltaic will use a net metering. We do have a new law now that does allow people to sell power at a set rate for 20 years, and we might hear a little bit about that. Net metering, although it's great, and I think we'll hear from Mark talking how wonderful this policy is, it is capped, and I think he'll address that a little bit later, and there are reasons for it to be capped, but there are a lot of reasons to get rid of those caps or make them much higher. And then finally, we have a program in the state that directs 1% of the utility revenues to what's called a public benefits fund administrator. And that goes into a pot of money that provides rebates and energy audits and things like that to make us more efficient. So that's called a demand-side management program. But 1% of current utility revenues go into that fund. It's about $20 million a year, and that's run by a third party. So we also have various incentives on the transportation side. If you get an electric vehicle, what is it currently, 3,000? You get a nice state tax credit, you get a federal tax credit. So there are some incentives out there for these other transportation technologies. So that's a really quick lay of the land. Representative Thielen mentioned the barrel tax that we passed last year. This is a new policy, but the challenge that she brought up, the vast majority of that goes to the general fund. A sliver goes to ag initiatives, and then a smaller, or another chunk goes to energy. So we are hoping next year, too, to direct much more of that into energy and ag initiatives. And it makes sense to tap the problem, the source of our problem, to fund the solutions. And it is we are one of the first states to have this sort of policy. But going forward, we face potentially a dramatic change in Hawaii. I mean, we were absolutely tied to the price of oil, the security of that supertanker arriving every week, and we have made some incremental progress. As you saw, we've made some treading water progress since the late 70s. But I really want to pose to these two guys what it's going to take to truly transform Hawaii into that clean energy, the preferred clean energy future. And maybe we can start just by asking, what's working today for both of you, and what are some of the barriers currently that you guys are facing?